Welcome to Webinar 4 in the Introduction to Curriculum Design and Medical Education Scholarship for Resident Trainees series. We will talk about educational theories and strategies within Kern's curriculum development for medical education. The goal of this webinar will be to have you, the learner, become adept at choosing educational strategies to optimize your curriculum. The objectives are as follows. By the end of this webinar, the learner will be able to 1. Describe basic principles of adult learning theory. 2. Classify their individual curricular objectives into cognitive, affective, and psychomotor objectives. And 3. Choose an appropriate educational strategy for each curricular objective. Let's recap where we are in Kern's 6 steps. We started with our problem ID and general needs assessment, then moved to a needs assessment of targeted learners, developed our goals and objectives, and now we are at our educational strategies. This slide introduces a vignette we will be using for the exercises associated with this webinar. Dr. Frost is a junior faculty member at Big University Medical Center and is tasked with creating a central line training program for his GME program. Dr. Frost has completed Kern's steps 1 through 3 and is now prepared to move on to the educational strategies phase. Throughout this webinar, we will help Dr. Frost unveil his new central line training curriculum. Before we can talk about educational strategies, we need to discuss what makes adult learners different. By doing so, we will need to briefly touch on the science of adult learning by discussing learning theories. We will discuss andragogy and how this relates to active and experiential learning, as well as reflection on practice. Andragogy is the art and science of adult learning. Malcolm Knowles, an American educator, championed this phrase and has espoused 4 major characteristics of adult learners versus child learners, andragogy versus pedagogy. Adults are most interested in learning subjects that have an immediate relevance to their lives or jobs. Think of professional development workshops versus long division. Adults are problem-centered learners. Adults' motivation to learn is internal versus external. This dovetails with knowledge application. The motivation is to better your lives versus receiving a top mark on the exam. The adult's self-concept is that of a self-directed being, which allows the adult to actively direct his or her own learning. Finally, the adult learner has a wealth of prior experiences to connect to any new knowledge. So, these 4 characteristics: 1. Thirst for knowledge application. 2. Internal versus external motivation. 3. An independent learning mindset. And 4. Prior experiences all distinguish the adult versus child learner. Experiential learning is a hallmark of adult learning. John Dewey and Cole Ball spoke to this. Learners need to be active. This doesn't necessarily mean physical actions, but educational strategies must engage and require students to interact with the material. Learners need to experience what they are learning versus passively attempting to retain information. Education with adults must be a social and interactive process. Learners at this stage must participate in their own learning, as direct involvement will increase the likelihood of understanding. This can be done with hands-on skills stations, engaging the audience with tasks, small groups, the list goes on and on. The bottom line is that learning needs to be social. Let's review Kolb's experiential learning cycle to illustrate the importance of experiential learning. Learners have previous experiences to draw upon. Then you want learners to watch and learn new concepts. When reflecting upon the new knowledge in conjunction with prior experiences, the learner is able to create a new understanding. This can be tested out to form new concrete learning experiences. As you can see, reflection is key. Reflection can be in practice or afterwards. Reflecting is the act of thinking of how what you are doing fits with your previous life experiences and paradigms. This is essentially practice-based learning. Per educational theorist Donald Shawn, without reflection, there is no learning. This doesn't happen naturally and will need to be prompted. You need to be cognizant of how to incorporate this into educational strategies. This can be done creatively for large groups versus smaller groups. and can be combined into any number of educational strategies. For example, pausing the webinar and asking you to fill out your worksheet is an act of reflection. Or oftentimes, teachers will perform what is called a wraparound and ask everyone in the class to name one thing they have learned and how it will impact their life moving forward. Reflection is a key component to adult learning and must be incorporated to your educational strategies. When choosing educational strategies, it is important to remember that there are different types of learners. Fleming's model states that there are 4 different types of learners: visual, auditory, those who read/write, and kinetic. Visual learners learn best through seeing and from visual display, graphs, illustrations, diagrams, and videos. Auditory learners learn best through lectures and discussions. These learners can benefit from reading out loud. Written information can have very little meaning unless heard by the auditory learner. Conversely, learners who prefer to read and write written information can be very, very valuable. Kinetic learners require a hands-on portion. These learners do better in classes that feature a laboratory component. Having interactivity is key for these learners. Note, learning categories are not mutually exclusive between learners. Further, the learners themselves can vary with the subject matter as well. Let's talk about learning styles. The learning style inventory categorizes learning styles into 4 areas: accommodator, assimilator, diverger, and converger. The accommodator learns by doing and excels in problem solving. The strengths in Kolb's learning cycles are with the concrete experience and active experimentation. The converger highlights theory and abstract concepts, but also learns by doing. The strengths in Kolb's learning cycles are with abstract conceptualization and active experimentation. The diverger is imaginative and appreciates real-life experience and discussion, and would rather observe than do. The strengths in Kolb's learning cycles are with the concrete experience and reflective observation. The assimilator excels with theoretical models and facts, and would rather observe than do. The strength in Kolb's learning cycle are with the abstract conceptualization and reflective observation. Since not everyone learns in a similar fashion, it would be ideal to diversify your educational strategy to meet all learner types. Further, a diversity of options will hold your learner's interest. Refer to Part 1 of your discussion sheet. Please write down 5 different educational strategies you have encountered. Then reflect and write down how these engage different learning styles and types of learners. Pause the lecture and take time to complete this portion of the discussion sheet. When you have completed this exercise, please move on to the next slide. So, to recap the midway point, we have just discussed the following. 1. Adult learning and how andragogy differs from pedagogy in that adults are driven by internal motivation and a desire for practical application of knowledge. Further, adults participate in their own education and are able to draw on a wealth of experiences to reflect upon practice. The second set of topics dealt with reflection and experience, and how bringing both these to your educational strategy was paramount to adult learners. Finally, we discussed different learner types and styles, and how that meeting a diversity of types and styles was the ideal way to engage multiple learners. Now that we have talked about learning theory and how adults learn, let's move on to picking educational strategies. We need to remember that curriculum content comes from the learning objectives. There are 3 types of learning objectives: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Cognitive objectives are those that want the learner to improve their cognitive skills, such as clinical decision making. Affective objectives are those that want the learner to change a specific attitude or outlook. Psychomotor objectives are those that focus on improving procedures or techniques. Think of a peanut butter and tuna fish sandwich, 2 fine sandwich ingredients, but 2 that do not complement each other at all. Congruence is important not only in sandwiches, but when picking educational methods. In addition to keeping educational theories and learning styles in mind, when selecting educational methods, you must also maintain congruence between your objectives and methods. For example, for Dr. Frost, it would be difficult to teach a central line curriculum by only group discussion and reflection upon experiences. Or, board score improvement would be difficult using small group role play. In other examples, let's talk about some games. Think of charades and how this is a demonstration in congruence. This is a game based around an effective objective, as you are attempting to convince another party of who you are. In this situation, role play works perfectly. Games such as Trivial Pursuit are focused around knowledge-based objectives, which is demonstrated via a Q&A format, which is very appropriate for cognitive objectives. Finally, do you remember in physics class having to build a bridge out of popsicle sticks? This is an example of an appropriately matched method to the psychomotor objective of creating a bridge. In this situation, reciting facts about the bridge would not address the psychomotor objective. Refer to Part 1 of your discussion sheet. Create and categorize Dr. Frost's objectives into the corresponding categories of cognitive, affective, and psychomotor objectives. Pause the lecture and take time to complete this portion of the discussion sheet. When you have completed this exercise, please move on to the next section. Let's talk about educational methods for cognitive objectives. Targeted readings and lectures are low-cost methods to reach large amounts of learners. Unfortunately, both of these methods involve passive learning. Program learnings are program textbooks or software that will present the material in a sequential manner in which the learner can progress at their own rate, much like this web-based series. PBL and team-based learning and learning projects can also be used to teach cognitive objectives and offer an advantage of being more interactive than readings and lectures. There are many strategies that can work to achieve psychomotor objectives. Ideally, learners are introduced to skills via didactics discussions, then learners are given an opportunity to practice the new skill. The learner will then need to reflect on the recent practice and have feedback given to them. This cycle will repeat until the desired skill level is achieved. It is also important to foster a safe learning environment. Affective objectives are notoriously difficult to measure and change. Educational strategies revolve around exposure and facilitating reflection in the desired topic or topics. The facilitation techniques with individuals and with groups that promote openness, introspection, and reflection are most helpful with this category of objectives. Discussion, reflection, and simulation all lend themselves nicely to this. Also, role modeling or reflection on real-life scenarios can be very effective. As you can see, many methods can reach multiple types of objective categories. When choosing amongst a multitude of educational strategies available, it is important that there are multiple strategies chosen. There is no single best strategy for any one objective. Multiple strategies offer complementary ways to achieve the same objective and can enhance learning. Further, multiple strategies can target different objective categories and achieve a crossover effect. Refer to Part 1 of your discussion sheet. Choose an appropriate educational strategy for each one of Dr. Frost's objectives for the Central Line training program. Pause the lecture and take time to complete this portion of the discussion sheet. When you have completed this exercise, please move on to the next slide. When thinking of multiple strategies, it is always important to be careful not to bite off more than you can chew. When selecting an educational strategy, it is important to consider what resources are available for the said strategy. There needs to be a consideration for the feasibility for implementation, delivery, and evaluation. Without this, then the educational objective will not be able to be measured in a realistic manner. The reality is that the feasibility of an educational strategy needs to be balanced with the selection of type and number of strategies. Let's recap the second half of the lecture. 1. We talked about the 3 objective categories: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. 2. We briefly discussed the number of educational strategies available and how important it is to maintain congruence between objectives and educational strategies. For a full list, see Kern Table 5.2. And 3, we discuss that feasibility must be framing the selection of any educational strategy. After you have reflected on Part 1 and received feedback on your answers, please think about your own scholarly project in medical education. How have you ensured that you will have a diversity of educational methods? Have you paid attention to keeping educational methods congruent with your objectives? Are these methods feasible? Please consider how the material on Webinar 4 applies to your project. And using the feedback you have received from Part 1, please complete the Part 2 discussion sheet. This concludes Webinar 4 of this series, Introduction to Curriculum Design and Medical Education Scholarship for Resident Trainees. Please continue on to Webinar 5.